right, awesome. Well, Tom, thank you so much for coming on once again. And before we even get started, we do have some gifts for you.
Oh.
So hopefully the next time you sign your next $1 billion deal, you use it with Hwood Inc.
Oh, that's
yes.
Jeez. This is very, very generous and very unnecessary. This is ink, I gather.
Yes.
That's great.
You know, as time goes on, I mean, we're still starving GPs, but for you, we have to figure out ways to make it better.
Yeah, that's very nice. And, you know, I don't want to waste a lot of your time doing this, but, oops,
it fell out.
Yeah, I did it upside down. This is great.
There we go.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Absolutely great. Thank you very, very much.
Of course, now in spirit of remaining in Europe, so that's from France, we have Belgian chocolates, truffle chocolates, during our trip over there during the holiday season.
Thank you.
As well as, I remember hearing that you drink almost exclusively Italian wine.
Well, that's right.
And that's where this comes in.
Oh, thank you very much. Oh, God, you guys are very generous. Never, you know, I think enough of what you're doing. You didn't have some break. A low Barolo. The 2019. This is great.
And we thought that the animal on that was very representative of, you know, the impact you have as a lion.
Oh, that's
great.
That's beautiful.
Yes,
Thank
of course.
Very, very much. You guys are very generous. But really.
So this is my 5th time reading your book, Reflections of an Ordinary Man, and in actually opening it up, because this was actually the book that I brought when I met you for the first time. And it said, Caleb with best wishes for great success, March 2019. So time has truly flown.
It has.
It's been about 6 years.
That's great. I mean, that's the first time you and I sat down.
That was the first time right behind there. And I remember when I came in with this book, I had, all the pink Post-it notes and stuff like that. So,
well, I won't, I daren't take any credit for any of your success, but you've done terrifically, Caleb, in those 6 years. So that's great.
Thank you. That means the world.
Yeah.
And thank you for being
to watch.
Thank you. Well, thank you for, I mean, it definitely couldn't have, made it this far without your support. So, you've had a tremendous impact on my life.
Well, thank you.
Thank
you. It's been a joy to work with you. So
thank you. Thank you. And thank you for being also the first guest on Titan's Journey. I mean,
excited to do that.
So really the reason why we called it Titan's Journey is because we want to interview today's titans of today's leading institutions. And when it comes to Bozzuto, whether you're in Virginia, PA, DC, Baltimore, Miami, the one thing that is constant is that you facilitate sanctuary in all these environments. Your locations are in the best locations. And in terms of the details and the quality that your assets provide, it's completely unparalleled. And so even when it came to my own trying to figure out what I'm trying to be in life, the quality, even before meeting you, going into the Bozzuto assets, there was just a foundational standard that you've been able to replicate time and time again.
Thank you.
So for those who may not be familiar with Bozzuto, what is Bozzuto, the Bozzuto company?
It is a company in which 4,000 people are committed to creating sanctuary. We develop, build, and manage apartments. We were started together with several partners. I started the company 37 years ago. We've developed something in the order of 30,000 homes and apartments. We manage 120,000 apartments, and so we manage for others as well as for ourselves, and we build for others as well as ourselves. We've built about 60,000 apartments in the time we've been in business. So that's our company in a nutshell.
And how many states are you in now?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that. It used to be 13. I think it's something like 17 or 18, but don't hold me to that.
Man. Well, that's phenomenal growth over 37 years. But today is about the Titan, which the company was named after. And so did you always know that you wanted to be a real estate developer? Was that your track?
No. I mean, I grew up in a working class family. My father worked in a factory. My mother worked in the kitchen. And I knew I wanted to go to college, but I had no idea what a white collar job was. I just knew it was expected by my father in particular that I would have one. I knew there were teachers. I knew there were lawyers. And I guess I knew there were insurance people because we were growing up in Connecticut, but that was sort of it. So no, I had no expectation that I would become a real estate developer when I was a kid. At one point, I thought I'd be a dentist. That didn't last. I also thought at one point that I'd be a priest. So, none of that stuck. But it wasn't until later in my life that becoming a developer appealed to me, occurred to me actually.
And so, I mean, I guess prior to finding your journey on the business aspect of things, I believe you also went to, Vietnam as well. Was that before or after college?
It was in the middle of graduate school. I was, well, let me go back to your first question a second. When I was in college, and my senior year was 1968, and the Detroit race riots had occurred already in 67. In 68, Dr. King was killed. Bobby Kennedy was killed. There were riots in all the cities. And, I was a senior in college without a clue of what I was going to do with my life. At Hobart College, where I went, we tended to have very close, one of the great things about the school is you have great close relationships with faculty and there's a real mentor relationship. And one of the faculty members suggested that I think about working on cities because of what was going on, because I had always shown an affection for cities. I had a poster of Chicago on one wall in my room and a poster of New York on another wall. And so I ended up going to graduate school and getting a degree in urban studies and public administration because I thought it was through the government that you could work in the cities, that you could accomplish something in the cities. So that's how I got involved, involved with real estate in cities.
I was going to ask, prior to making that adjustment, I believe you majored in English as well, starting out. What was the thought process behind selecting that? Did you think you'd go into teaching or become a writer? Or what was the decision behind becoming an English major prior to making that shift?
I wasn't smart enough to do science. And I loved to read. I've always loved to read. My mother used to come into my room and say that I was going to go blind because I'd be sitting there with a flashlight under the blankets reading, 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. So that was sort of a pretty natural selection. I thought with that, I'd probably become a lawyer. And that was my expectation. To the degree I thought about it, I was pretty caught up in the moment.
Got it. So you did the, public administration. How did that track into, was Vietnam right after that?
No. While I was in graduate school, I got a fellowship. I was awarded a fellowship from the Ford Foundation and USAID to go to Calcutta, India for a year and work in their city planning department. And then I would have come back and finished graduate school 6 months later. But that meant I needed to get an extension. I had a deferment for my education, but it only lasted until the summer of 69. So this meant I would have had to get an extension to my deferment. So I went to my draft board, to plead my case, to ask for an extension of my deferment. I thought they would be impressed by the fact that a local boy had gotten this fancy fellowship. But I may have reflected that arrogance in my attitude. I don't know. It may have been the beard I was wearing at the time or the very long hair I had at the time. But when I got through, the woman who was the chairwoman of the draft board, who I swear had blue hair, looked at me and said, "Sonny, if you want to go to Southeast Asia so badly, we'll be glad to send you."
Oh, man.
And 2 weeks later, I was drafted.
Oh,
Wow.
man.
Yeah.
And so, is there anything from that, stint in the military that you kind of take into your life today?
When I got out of graduate school, when I got out of the military and I went to graduate school, my first paper was on how awful the draft was and how we should do away with it, now anti-American. But as I sit here as a much older man, I can't help but think that the learning experience of being with people of all types, being with people of all educational levels, of all mental capacity, of all physical capacity, that you had when you were thrown into a draft, was a uniquely valuable experience. And I grew up in a blue-collar community, so I already knew a lot of kids who were from working-class families. A lot of kids who go to college today have never known anybody who worked with their hands. And I think that's awful. And it's in our business and the real estate business, what I have found, is that experience in the Army, plus honestly, the later experience of working a couple of years in the government, was as valuable in preparing me for success probably as the time I spent in school. I learned how to deal with people. I learned what concerned people in a way that I'm not sure I would have learned otherwise.
And prior to going to Asia, did you, coming from a blue collar environment, did you travel outside the country prior to that?
No.
Or was that the first time?
No.
I would love to hear from your perspective, coming from the States, the culture shock and your first impressions when you were living over there.
Sure. First of all, I'd only flown in an airplane once before. And that was when the colleges paid for me to go to some event in New York City. It's an interesting question because I've often thought about what a shock it was when we arrived in Vietnam. Because you listen to the news, and the news tends to create impressions in your mind that aren't always correct.
Mm-hmm.
And I was convinced that as we got off the airplane in Vietnam, we would have to fight our way, into some
In the
dugout
jungle.
or something,
Yeah.
And so I was astonished as we were circling the airport in Saigon, Tan Son Nhut, that everybody, I won't say everybody was calm. Certainly none of the GIs were calm, but the stewardesses were calm and the stewards. And then we landed and they had us just get up and start walking out the door. And I'm saying, "Where's my flak jacket?
Where's your rifle?"
Where's my M16? And then we get into air conditioned buses. But the one thing you notice in Vietnam, the most distinct thing initially, was the smell. And the smell was, as bad as anything I've ever smelled in my life.
How would you describe it? Was it a distinct smell that when you were there, was it something that you've ever smelled before? Or was it just something that's awful?
It's something I've never smelled before and hope to never smell again.
I won't ask that question ever again.
I mean, it was the smell of petroleum.
Yeah.
It was the smell of gunpowder, and it was the smell of burning human feces,
Right.
because there was no sewer system in any place.
Yeah.
And it was awful. And, people, again, you can edit this, so you can take this out of there. But people, we played a little parlor game once with a bunch of friends, and we're going around the room to ask who had the worst job. And I was telling them about a week in Vietnam when I first got there, when I was waiting for my orders. And my job was, together with a couple of other guys, to go and take these, what we called honey buckets, which were from the latrines, and you'd pull them out and you'd take them and you'd set them on fire. And that was how you'd clean them. That was how you get rid. And it was awful. Trust me, it was as awful as it sounds.
But I feel like there's probably so much that was gained from that in terms of not just inner resilience, but also being able to just do whatever is necessary, especially because I'm pretty sure, management, construction, and all the other things that you have to deal with in your day-to-day life, there's no task that's beneath you because you've emptied latrines in the military. You've been drafted and were sent across the world and didn't know what that was going to look like.
I think that's absolutely right, Caleb. You learn that there's nothing that you can't do if you have to do it. But you also learn to empathize with people who you've asked to do difficult things, like building buildings when it's 7 degrees outside, like we're doing right now. I spent yesterday out visiting my construction sites because those guys are out there doing what they have to do, but and they're doing it with a smile, but it's a tough job when it's 7 degrees or when it's 100 degrees.
Right.
So, yeah.
Man, so you were in Vietnam for how long? For about a year or two?
365 days.
365 days. So after that 1 year stint, where did life take you?
Well, I got married while I was in Vietnam.
Shout out to Barbara.
Yeah. I had met, the woman who became my wife, I think 3 years earlier. But we had only dated once or twice. And I had taken her to a family picnic. Then I had asked her to go out New Year's Eve, and she said no, she couldn't go. She had another date.
Man.
Then I asked her, to go to Woodstock with me. And this, you got to remember, this is the 60s or 70s, whatever, late 60s. And her mother wouldn't let her. And she, only a year younger than me. So we were in our early 20s, but still parents had a lot of influence back then. When I was on leave from the military, about to go to Vietnam, we dated for a couple of weeks. When I was in Vietnam, we corresponded. I had figured out how to manipulate the phone system. So I was calling her. But honestly, anyhow, and during one of those calls, she said, "Do you really want me to go into this whole story?"
No, absolutely. Yeah,
please.
Okay.
But people are struggling out here.
Well, keep in mind now, we dated a few weeks, but we were talking on the telephone, and during one of these calls, she said, she was living in Connecticut, and she said, she was teaching at a music school, and the music school wanted to send her to LA for a conference, an educational conference. And she said, "What if I were to get a flight to Hawaii? Can you meet me in Hawaii?" And I said, "When is it?" And it was like a month later. And I said, that's tough. That's the hardest R&R to get. But I can try. So I was an enlisted man. I was a draftee, so at the time I was a Spec 2, I think, a corporal. So I went to my lieutenant. I had a Lieutenant Frank DeBella, an Italian guy who I really liked, and I told him the opportunity I had, and which is how I saw it. And Frank said, "Come with me and keep your mouth shut, and to do what I ask you to do." So I went with him to the personnel office, and this fellow, who I'm sure was from Iowa or Nebraska or someplace, and never seen two Italian guys together, looked at us and said, "What can I do for you?" And I told him I wanted the pass to go on R&R in Hawaii in a month. he looked at me and then at the lieutenant and said, "There's just no way I can do that." He said, that's the hardest R&R to get. You should have asked 4 months ago.
Mm.
So the lieutenant said, "Look, buddy, you don't get it. This kid needs to go to Hawaii." And the guy said, "Why does anybody need to go?" And Frank said, "Well, I'll tell you." Lieutenant DeBella said, "Listen, I'll tell you." He said, "This boy's Italian and his girlfriend's Italian and she's knocked up." Which was complete fabrication, completely untrue. But that's what he said. And he said, and if you don't give him an R&R to go to go on leave to Hawaii, and if he lives through Vietnam, and if he goes home, again, her father's Italian. Her father's going to shoot him. So this guy, wide-eyed, immediately writes an order and says, "Here, you can go." So I called Barbara when I got back and said, "You won't believe this, but they think we're getting married." And she made some appropriate sounding noises. I had no intention of getting married, but when I arrived in Hawaii and we walked to the hotel room, she started telling me, I said to her, "Look, obviously this marriage thing, it was just a lark." And she said, "Well, not so fast." And I started giving me reasons why we should get married. And I started coming up with lots of reasons about why we couldn't. I had to go back to college, graduate school. I had student debt, a whole bunch of things. Anyhow, I finally ran out of excuses and I said, "You had nothing to wear." And she pulled out this pretty white dress. And I said, "I had nothing to wear." And she flipped over. Back in those days, Samsonite luggage had a divider in the middle. She flipped over the divider and pulled out a navy blue suit. And at that point, I gave up, and we were married that afternoon, and have been married 55 years this April.
Wow. Man, that's determination right there.
Also with Barbara, having the problems come up and finding the solutions or a reason why.
Oh yeah.
And then when you discuss, meeting in Hawaii, and then discussing the story of how you got it, planting that seed where she started thinking, this is somebody I can consider spending the rest of my life with. That also speaks on.
But she had incredible persistence. But you think about the leap we were both taking, and the leap of faith. We'd known each other a couple of years, but we'd only dated for a month at most.
Yeah.
Right.
And here we are. And I get such a charge out of young people today who live together 4, 5, 10 years before they decide to get married because
guilty.
They want to. It seems so silly.
Yeah.
Indecisive.
So I guess one of the lessons also is have friends with decision makers because you might just get a wife out of it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
that's right.
I was going to ask, during the time spent with her during this entire 40 plus years, what is one thing that you admire about her the most, and what's a memory that you always go back to that puts a smile on your face when you think of the two of you?
Oh boy, that one's hard because there's so many of them, I guess. But I was saying to her the other day, we are both obviously no longer spry chickens, and she has stayed absolutely beautiful. But when I see her, I'm not looking at a woman who is my age. I was thinking she's, I see the girl I married. It's an amazing thing. And I don't know how to explain it otherwise, but she hasn't aged in my mind. So the person you would see when you met her is very different than the person I see every day. And I, so my image of her, I still remember, and I still remember our honeymoon, her putting shaving cream on her face because she had sunburn,
Yeah.
the menthol shaving cream.
Yeah.
Anyhow, but yeah.
Yeah, but so that's really interesting. So we go from Vietnam, getting married. So it's a vortex of change that you're going through.
Right.
And then how do you transition back into, you go from Vietnam to where in the United States, and how does your career evolve from there?
I came home, and her father said, I've got $1,000 that I can either spend on a wedding reception. I can give you to use as a down payment on a house, or you could use to take a trip. And we immediately said, we're out of here. We went away. We went to Europe for 45 days. So even though Vietnam was the first place I had visited, when we got back, we visited, 7 or 8 countries in Europe. But then I went back to graduate school, finished graduate school. When I graduated in 1971, the job market wasn't all that great. But the Maxwell School public administration degree was, it gave me some opportunities. And one of them was with HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And they gave me a choice of working in Pittsburgh, Richmond, or Baltimore. And we were two, sort of Italian kids. We wanted to be able to get back to Connecticut fairly easily. Baltimore was the closest of the three. It also had major race riots during the 60s, so it was a place where I felt I could have some real impact in the community. So we decided to move to Baltimore. We moved to Baltimore. I worked for the government for a couple of years. It was a great experience, and was a very educational experience. I learned that the incentive system in the government is perverse, which is an important thing to understand if you're out there trying to get governmental people to make tough decisions. There is no, they don't get extra money. They don't get pats on the back if they take risks. And so they're encouraged to be afraid. And they're not encouraged to take risk. And if you understand that, it makes it easier to work with them. And little gestures are appreciated. You learn, for example, that, a bouquet of flowers to thank somebody it's really appreciated. I'm looking for a way to say that, but it's truly appreciated. Just showing them respect is appreciated because, you think about the environment we live in today and the amount of disrespect shown to government employees. Some of whom were doing many of them were doing very, very important jobs. That's awful. And I think part of the success we've had as a development company is understanding how to work with public officials.
So I know we covered, some of the softer side of working within the government system. What was your scope of work in working at HUD? What were some of the projects that, what was your day-to-day life looking like execution-wise?
I was initially hired as an intern, which meant I got exposure to a lot of different places, but my job there was called multifamily housing rep. And there were, if I remember right, 3 of us handling the state of Maryland. And so I was responsible for all multifamily housing in Baltimore City and then on the Eastern Shore, for providing funding, for working with developers, working with public housing agencies. So it was a great experience, not only in terms of what we talked about, learning how it feels to be a public employee, but it was also a great experience because I learned the HUD programs pretty intimately. And then years later, when I went and became a developer, I was able to use both the relationships I had built, but the knowledge of the HUD programs to finance a number of the projects I was working on.
And during your time working for the government, is that where the seed of Bozzuto, the Bozzuto company, was planted, where you started thinking of that idea, or was that after?
It really was after. I mean, what happened was, what I learned one of the other things I learned in my 2 years at the government was that I was not cut out, to be a government employee. I don't want to go down a deep hole and explain it. But I will say in the 2 years, I got a number of promotions, but I also got reprimanded several times for working too hard and for pushing my colleagues to work hard when the president, Nixon at the time, was trying to slow down programs. So I knew I wasn't cut out to work for the government, and I felt that the guys in the private sector were having more impact on the environment. Mm. I left and went to work for the Rouse company. Because Rouse, at the time, had a great reputation. They had developed Columbia. They were developing Columbia. They had developed the project in the Inner Harbor at Harbor Place. A similar project in Boston was underway. So they were very, very highly regarded at the time. I went to work there, and what I did was project finance. And while that was a great learning experience because I was financing things other than housing, I realized that I still was not having the kind of impact on the environment that I wanted to have. Keep in mind, I'd gotten out of college wanting to make the cities a better place to live. Mm-hmm. I'd worked for the government, then I worked for HUD, and while I wasn't doing any harm and I was doing probably some good, I was not having the kind of direct contact, direct impact that I wanted to have. A friend created the opportunity for me to, we also were not all that fond of living in Baltimore at the time. So a friend created the opportunity for me to be interviewed by and then ultimately hired by a development company that was based in New England, doing some work down here. And they were interested in me, in large part because of who I had gotten to know while working at HUD and Rouse, and in part because of what I knew about the HUD programs. So I went to work for them. That was a company called Oxford Development Company. Oxford moved my wife, moved Barbara and I, and our then one child, to Boston. My wife especially, we're New Englanders. She loved living up there. We ended up with a very nice house in Needham outside of Boston. But every day I was having to go either go downtown Boston and freezing my backside doing it, or going to the airport and flying to Baltimore, where I was spending 3 days every week. And I hadn't realized that was sort of the agenda of this company. And after being there 2 years, they called me in. The head guy called me into his office and said, "Tom, you've done a great job. In fact, you've done such a great job. We're going to close this office and move the whole operation back to Maryland." I convinced them to give me another year up there, but at the time, Massachusetts was a very, very, very hard place to develop in. was very anti-development. And at the time, quite honestly, there was a fair amount of corruption, and we didn't want anything to do with that. So after another year, in probably the most difficult negotiation of my life, I convinced my wife to move with me back down to Maryland, and we returned. I proceeded to work for Oxford for another couple of years. And then in 1979, I left them and started a new business, started my first business with a fellow by the name of Richard Marin, and it was called Marin Bozzuto. And we developed one project. It was an affordable project. And I had done a fair amount of affordable housing with Oxford.
Mm-hmm.
But Richard's a wonderful guy. He's long now deceased, but he was a wonderful fellow. Probably 10 years older than me. But his work habits were very different than mine. I mean, he would show up to work late. He would want to just sit around and chat or talk to a stockbroker. And I was pretty industrious. I wanted to conquer the world. And after 2 years of working with him, Oxford came back to me and offered me a much larger position within the company. They asked me to come back as the regional partner responsible for all of their operations in the Mid-Atlantic. So I sold my share of the business back to Richard, went back to Oxford, and was then there until 88.
88.
During the time of, leaving your corporate job when you were first with them, having a salary and then taking that jump with partnering with your friend, and for a couple of years working on a specific project, having your first child, how can you describe from the startup perspective of the founder was there income coming in from the project? How did you guys survive from a financial standpoint? And touch on that, because it sounds very daunting for people that are in their corporate job. Maybe they've been working in real estate for a developer for 5 years, and they want to take that next step to do their first project as entrepreneurs.
Well, I honestly don't remember what income we had during the time I was with Richard. I can tell you there was very little of it. And I can also tell you that I was spending what seemed like as much time filling out governmental forms as I was being a developer. All the crap that our government that requires of you. My wife, Barbara, had gone back to work. We had 2 children at this time. A second child had been born in Boston. So we now had 2 children. And yet she went back to work so that we could live while I was partnered with Richard. And I had a reasonably good income at Oxford. It was much harder the second time, because by that point in 1988, my income at the company had been quite good. We had a second home. The kids were no longer toddlers. They were old enough so that we knew and they were in private school, and we knew we were going to have to send them to college. So having a college fund was important. And while we had figured out and organized the Bozzuto in such a way that there would be income, the founders all had to take substantial pay cuts. And I think my compensation was reduced probably 70% from what it had been. And, we had a family meeting. Toby or Lexi can tell you about it.
And how old were they at this time, roughly?
Toby was probably 15.
Okay.
Lexi was 13. Got them sitting around the kitchen table. There are these vignettes you remember throughout your life. You can still remember that meeting. And I told them I had been offered a job, by Carmel Crow, residential. And I would have had to travel down to Northern Virginia every day. But it was good pay. It was close to what I was making at Oxford. Or I could start my own business and take a 2/3 cut in pay. And my wife, God love her, was incredibly supportive. And the kids, I mean, they're young, you know what, but they felt like they had an opinion, and I can't, I mean, I don't think Toby was supportive. He liked the lifestyle we had. And I don't remember where Lexi was on it, but, we were able to cope. And again, Barbara went back to work and did what she had to do. She, you know, I don't, we have a great number of women working in my company, and we have women in incredibly important positions, senior positions, partner positions, leadership positions. And our company would not be what it is today without their leadership. The challenges a woman faces, and particularly in my generation, do I stay home and take care of the kids? I can tell you my wife would always feel guilty that she was not using her brains during those years when she stayed home and took care of my kids. And then she'd go to work, and she was in Mayor Schmoke's cabinet, for example, and ran the Office of Promotion and Tourism for a couple of years. So she had good jobs. And she had her own little business for a while doing sports promotions. Did a couple of Olympic events here in Baltimore. So she had very good jobs. She had a smart lady, smarter than I am. But she felt guilty the entire time she was working that she wasn't home taking care of the kids. So there's this constant tension that I think also informed us, me and my partners, and the way we built the company and the way we ran the company and even where we located the company. And I think it's an important thing for people to understand when you're running a business.
And I know we jumped to starting the company. Where did the idea originate from? And then how did the two other partners come into the mix? And what made you decide to call it the Bozzuto Company, having two other partners?
Sure. I suspect that there is not an employee or anyone who's ever been an employee at some point think they're smarter than their boss. And in some respects, they're probably right. They're probably saying things the boss doesn't see. And I was no different. And you know, and I can still sit here today and tell you what things my boss at Oxford did wrong. What the owner of Oxford did wrong. But you begin, I guess if your ego is big enough, you begin to say, I could do it better. You know, look at the mistakes they're making. Look at the money I'm making for them. I can do better. And so if you're fortunate, an opportunity occurs that gives you the motivation to do that. Sure. Well, in 1986, Congress passed a major revision in the tax law that Oxford, and eliminated a piece of the tax law that Oxford had been able to build its entire business on. And all of us saw it coming. We tried to fight against it, but Oxford had failed to prepare a business model that would cover them or carry them in the event this change went through. So there was a great flailing if you will, on the company's part, as they had to shrink, as they had to deal with the problem. And Oxford was at the time, I think, the third largest developer, builder, manager of apartments all over the country. It had 5 or 7 offices, and where I had counterparts doing development, construction management. So it was a big company. And but it was to a significant degree a one-trick pony. And it had tried to diversify a little bit, but those efforts had not panned out really well. Anyhow, so I and the Mid-Atlantic region, fortunately, was very healthy. So I watched as the company contracted, had problems, people were getting laid off and getting fired. And our company continued to make money, continued to do deals. And we had found in our region a way of financing our projects in partnership with institutions, that was frankly different than what Oxford had been doing. And so we continued to be viable. Finally, and I was running the region. Rick Mostyn was my CFO. John Slidell and Bernie Loveshire were basically the 2 principal developers and kind of overseeing the other developers. In January of 1988, we had a deal in Gaithersburg, Maryland that was ready to go. We just needed an equity partner. So I went together with Rick up to visit the people at Copley Real Estate Advisors, who had been one of the partners we had done a couple of deals with. And Copley was a very unique company, a financial company, because they'd actually let you come in and make a presentation to the loan committee or to the investment committee. So we did that. Came home. The following afternoon, I'm sitting at my desk. The following late morning, I guess it was, and I got a phone call from the principal person I dealt with at Copley saying, I've got some good news and I've got some bad news. The good news is that we've agreed to do this deal with you in Gaithersburg. We're ready to go. We not only want to do the equity, but we're willing to do the debt as well.
Oh, wow.
And it was great.
How big of a project is this for context?
This was a 250, 300 unit. I don't remember precisely, but 300 unit project called Bayberry, in Montgomery Village. And
is it townhouses?
No, they're rentals.
Okay.
Rentals. We did a lot of work in Gaithersburg over the years. And I said, okay, Kevin, what's the bad news? The fellow on the other end of the phone was Kevin Mahoney. He said, well, the bad news is that nobody from Oxford can be involved in the managing partnership. We want you to be the managing partner. I said, Kevin, how do I go to my boss and tell him that he can't have anything to do with this project and I got to be the managing partner? He said, well, that's the bad news. You got to figure that one out.
So there's good news and then there's great news.
Yeah, good news, great news, and some bad news. So I called the fellow who owned Oxford, a fellow by the name of Leo Zickler, and explained what had happened. Leo was a far bigger man than I am, because he didn't take my head off, which is what I expected. He was very thoughtful, always a very thoughtful guy. And he said, well, let me think about it and I'll call you back. Later that afternoon, he called me back and he said, you, Tom, have made several offers to buy your operation, and it's true. I had done that twice. Between 1986, when the tax bill passed, and 1988, I had sent 2 proposals in anger, saying, I can do better than you guys are doing. Let me run my operation. I'll buy it from you, without a clue how I can do it. Well, he said, firm up your offer, and we will go ahead and sell you your operation.
And how many units did you have in your operation at that time?
Well, my operation, what it ended up as it was a development operation where we had 4 or 5 projects in our pipeline. We had 7 projects under construction. And the combination allowed us to have not only future business, but current income. Because even though we had to take the development people and enough construction people to oversee those 7 projects. But we had income coming in. And some of it went back to Oxford as part of the deal that we struck with them. But some of it was what we used to feed ourselves. So anyhow, go backwards a moment to January. I've got this, but I don't have anything else. So first thing I did was I called Rick, because he and I had become very, very close friends. And he and I had been the ones who had talked about creating a new company. And at the time, Rick is a very very, very modest guy. And he always said it's going to be the Bozzuto company 100%. So that was sort of the thought. It was going to be the Bozzuto company. I'd own 100%. And Rick would come to work for me. So after Rick agreed this was a great opportunity that I had negotiated with Leo, I went to John and Bernie, and John and Bernie said, we just finished working with somebody we thought was crazy. We don't want to work on another guy we think is crazy. We will work with you, but we have to be owners of the company. And I was in a little bit of shock, because it wasn't what I was expecting. But I thought about it and I said, all right, there are 3 conditions that I'll agree to that on. One is that Rick be a partner and have an equal position with you. 2, that I control the majority of the stock. And 3, that the company have my name. They huddled for a few minutes and quickly agreed to all of those. So that's where the concept behind the company came from. But I think in your life, you go through periods where you kind of maybe work harder than you do at any other time, or you are forced to pull on resources greater than you have to at any other time in your life. And those 4 months between January, whenever that phone call was, and April 4th, which was the day that we not only separated from Oxford and officially became a company, but it was the day we started that Bayberry project. Those 4 months was the most intense period of labor, of expenditure of energy that I've ever, and maybe creativity, that because we had all right, so I had my 4 partners. I had a conceptual agreement with Leo that I was going to be able to buy my operation, and I had a lender equity partner on this one deal. I had no idea how I was going to feed myself, or let alone my partners. I had no idea how this deal I described to you, what it should look like. We had no capital. I mean, Oxford owed us a great deal of money and bonuses. but the bonuses were unpaid and they were scheduled to be paid over the next 4 years. So, what's that worth?
There's some great bonuses.
Great bonuses, right? And I had managed to save some money, but a major part of it was money that I was hoping to send my kids to college with. But, Rick was wonderful in taking the lead and negotiating a line of credit with Maryland National Bank. I found a venture capital firm who invested some equity with us. It was a company called Hwood Ventures Land and Cattle Company, Baltimore company. And it was, it ended up being a great deal for them and a great deal for us because they never took an interest in the company. And we had a right to pay them back, which is why it was a great deal for us. But they got to be involved in every project we did, and they got an ownership interest, and they are still getting, to this day, 36 years later, still getting some cash distributions from a couple of those projects. So everybody was happy. It was a really good deal. But, so we're negotiating with them. We're negotiating a closing with Copley, our investor lender. We're negotiating with Oxford, and it was a very tough negotiation. And we got all of that done in that 3.5, 4 month period. So, and you start the business and you don't go out and celebrate because you're sitting there saying, holy crap, what have I got here?
Yeah.
And John Slidell, and I should say, I did this and Rick did that. While we were doing that, John and Bernie were keeping the wheels on. John was the one who was doing the development of that the Bayberry project and getting all the final approvals. And Bernie was out looking for new deals. So, everybody was, and Bernie was, 20 years older, than any of us, had run a business, run it very successfully, sold a business, had a great reputation with investors, a great reputation with the banks. And so he gave us great credibility. Anyhow, so you don't celebrate. John was so cautious, he wouldn't let us put a sign on the building. Put the name of the company on the building because he wasn't convinced we were going to make it. Anyhow, it took us 5 years to convince him to let us put our name on the building. But it was, we had a lot of things that were very favorable. We ended up taking, besides the four of us, I think 18 other people, to finish building these 7 projects, to help us with development, to do our accounting. So that was.
So you were essentially vertically integrated day one, right? So did you do management, construction, and have all those aspects, or was it just acquisition and development at that point in time? Did you start layering, or?
No, it's really a really important question. We were just development and construction. But I had a conversation with Leo Sickler that I'm sure he doesn't remember, but that was after we settled, where I talked about management and should we have a management company? Because part of the deal they made with us was we were not allowed to take, while we could take these people we took, from Oxford, we couldn't take any of their property management employees. So, the question was, do we start a management company? And Leo made a really important point that I at least thought was very important. And it was that there are a lot of developers in the world, and when there's money, anybody can get money. Any developer can get money as long as they've got an attractive deal. But when there's no money, or when money is in shorter supply and you really got to compete for it, having a management company that allows you to create a name for your company as an operator, it makes you different than other developers, because you're a company of some substance and it has character. And as I thought about that, the other thing I remembered about that, or I thought about that, was that one of the things I had learned at the Rouse Company, where I worked in the mortgage business, is it's very tough to build a business where you're living on fee income. In the mortgage business, they have servicing income. So every time a mortgage broker does a loan with you, they place the loan with somebody else, but they get a little fee for servicing it for the lender. That servicing income gives them recurring income, so that you start the year knowing you can afford. You may not eat well, but you can afford to eat. So one of the benefits of starting a management company not only was what Leo had suggested, which was that you could better define who you were if you had a management company. But if it grew to a certain size, you could have recurring income from it and not have to do the next deal in order to eat. So that was the motivation. We hired a woman to create a management company for us. She worked for us for 6 or 7 months, and her father got ill and she had to leave and move back to California. But at that point, the 12 months was up. So we hired a woman by the name of Julie Smith, and of course, at that point, we were also beginning to turn over units on the Bayberry project, and we knew at least Julie could oversee that and get that done, and and we thought she had growth potential. Well, she helped us build the management company, took the lead as the first president of the management company, and built it up, I think, to $35,000 when she turned it over to Stephanie Williams.
And with the vision of the property management company and having a property management company, I feel like it's something that you are as intimate as one can be with your customer or the residents of the buildings. As you put, the point that you brought up is, building a sanctuary for those individuals. Who was the one that really instilled that vision amongst the team, and how is that communicated? And, having a fully vertical company on the construction development side and then bringing on property management, it's almost like its own startup.
Define your niche.
I know that you brought people in to assist, but what was the dynamic of you as the founder of the company and the vision that you've created, implementing that with new hires and building out that entire property management department?
That may be the most important part of our conversation, I think. Companies take on the culture of the leadership. I think you can tell when you go to any store who is running that store or what they're like by the way you're treated by the lowest paid employee. It just happens. We've been more conscious about it. We've been introspective and thoughtful. I hate to use the first person singular when I talk about my company because it's all been teamwork, but I guess to some significant degree, this vision of sanctuary was probably something I created. But Julie Smith had a great deal to do with defining what that meant and defining how we were going to service. And in some respects, service our customers. And in some respects, I've thought what I've been especially equipped to do with my English degree is put to words what I'm seeing other people do and create. But we have created this vision in our company that we separate ourselves apart from our competitors by focusing first and foremost on our residents. And I was talking yesterday, I was out visiting properties, which I do once a week. And I was talking to two of my new employees up in a property in Pennsylvania. And they had worked with two very highly regarded competitors, but they were telling me how much they enjoyed working with our company and how much they understood why our residents enjoyed our being involved, our company's involvement, as opposed to what they had seen with their former employers. And I was just curious to hear what their perspective was. And they said, I regard what this woman said for my former employer, but the first concern was always money. In our company, she said, the residents feel like you care about them. And it has always been my belief, that if you do your job better than anybody else, you take care of your customer better than anybody else, they'll pay you extra for the privilege. And so we've built an entire company around this notion that we'll take care of our customers better than anybody else. That's going to be our primary focus. To do that, I need employees and colleagues who feel valued. And so we take care of our employees better than anybody else. But the result of all that is that our investors and our clients for whom we manage third party, and our clients for whom we build, all feel like we're taking care of them, because they're making more money, they're getting higher rents, and then they turn to us and ask us to do more work with them, or are there to provide capital for us. So it's a virtuous cycle.
And one of the things that you've corrected me on throughout the years is the use of tenants, the use of the word tenants versus residents. And I think that's something that can be very easily overlooked, from someone from the outside looking in, because generally in the real estate investment community, sometimes it's like, how many units do you have? How many tenants do you have? Whatever the case may be, but really thinking about it in terms of residence, sanctuary. These are very distinctive words that, put Bozzuto on top in virtually most of the markets that you guys are in.
I think that there are a few conventions that come out of commercial real estate, income property real estate, that are bad for residential real estate. And one is this thing I was thinking of, the people who are your customers as tenants. You're right, they're residents, they're customers. And the second, one of the things that drives me crazy is when we talk about rent per square foot. My guidance to my colleagues at the company is, you don't buy a car by the pound, and you don't rent an apartment by the inch or square foot. You do it by the way it feels. And so your job is to make it feel larger than it is, so people will pay you more than they'll pay the next guy. But the second part of Dallas's question that I want to address, because I think it's important. It's not only important, but it's a little entertaining, because every year, I think Julie started this in our third year, we have these award banquets for our management people. And probably for most of the last 25 years, I've gone around, and even with Toby running the business for the past 8 years, they still allow me to speak. And I always go, when I visit the properties, I always say, what do you want to hear from me? What would you like me to talk about? And when we were a company of 20 people getting bigger, to a company of 2,000 people getting bigger, to today with a company of 4,000 people, what I would hear from my employees in terms of what I should talk about is the company is a wonderful company. We love its values, but we're terrified that as we continue to get bigger and we stretch into more states, we're going to lose that culture. So will you talk about how we preserve that culture? It is why when Toby took over as the CEO, the titles I chose for myself besides chairman was chief cultural officer, because we do have a distinct culture. Every company has a distinct culture. We're just very conscious about cultivating it and making sure people understand it. And, we try and keep it as simple. And I repeat it endlessly. I write about it. I talk about it. We have 4 values. They're simple one-word values. I talk about them. I embellish on them. Others do. Julie does. When John was with us, he's now retired. He did. Bernie, unfortunately, passed away very early in the company's history, and 2 years, 3 years in. But Toby talks about them. I mean, the values are important. They are.
And can you just name those values too?
Sure. I mean, they're, as I said, there are 4 words: concern, creativity, passion, and perfection. And to embellish on them a little bit, I always say, concern is our most important value. It means you treat people, starting with your fellow employees, you treat people like their family. You treat them with respect. You treat them with care. You are there for them, and they will be there for you. And it's the same thing for our customers, our clients. They're people. They're not factors of production. They're people. Creativity, I always say, we didn't hire you for your looks, even if they're good. We hired you because we want your brains. Use your brains. If there are things your former employer did better than us, tell us about them. We'll steal them. We don't mind. If there are things we're doing wrong, tell us about them. If there are better ways to take care of our customers, tell us about them. If you can't identify them, think about ways that you can be identifying them. Passion. When we first started the company, this value was called aggressiveness.
I like that.
Well, I know, but some of our construction guys got carried away with that word, so we changed it to passion. But what we mean is really simple. If you don't love what you're doing and can't put 100% of yourself into it every day, then for your own sake, as much as ours, go find something else to do. I don't care whether you've got a broom in your hand or you're the CEO. Every day you should be passionate about what you're doing, passionate about our customers, passionate about your fellow employees. And perfection is the one that always drives the professional consultants nuts, because they say, oh, you're terrifying your employees, you're intimidating them, no one's perfect. To which I answer, Beethoven, Michelangelo, Chopin, DiMaggio, I mean, the list goes on of people who, while not perfect, certainly were worthy of emulation. And, I'll never be a Michelangelo, but I can certainly bust my backside getting it right. I mean, so often you see people excuse unacceptable work by saying, "What do you want? I'm only human." And I find that as being almost cause for separation of employment. I mean, I don't want people working with me who are willing to accept that kind of an excuse. Einstein was only human.
Yeah.
I mean, give me a break.
Right. And I feel like touching on these values, it's also a perfect segue into your book. Because I know we've talked about the journey. So in terms of Reflections of an Ordinary Man, what drove you or inspired you to write the book in the first place?
I have been collecting these ideas, these reflections, my entire life. And Barbara facilitated that by giving me these beautiful leather-bound books from Italy that had blank pages in them that I can, write my notes. And I probably had, 8 or 9 of them. When I turned over the business, the leadership of the business to Toby, I mean, I wasn't stopping work. I still work. And I was chairman of the board of Hobart College at the time. So Hobart and Smith. So it wasn't that I had a lot of free time, but I was still terrified of what I was going to do and that I was going to feel purposeless. And Barbara suggested that I collect and edit my ideas. And I mentioned to Julie Smith that I was doing that. And she said, if you're doing that, why don't we get you an editor? And you could do a book. And on our 30th anniversary, which was coming up in 12 months, we can give every one of our employees a copy of the book. So we did that. We had the book produced. We gave each of our employees a copy. Then Julie said, why don't we give it to all of our clients and partners? And we did that. And then the editor said, well, doing that, I'm going to put it on Amazon if you don't mind. So we put it on Amazon and the thing started selling. So, and it's still available on Amazon.
So for everyone listening, Ray Dalio has principles. This is in so many real estate books are just self-promotional, buy low, sell high, summaries. There's very few real estate books from real estate founders that you can really read and get, meaningful, insights from. And this is definitely one of them. So you split the book into 2 different, sections. One is building a life and the second is building a business. And so there's just so many things that we can talk about in each section, but even just in the very beginning, you talked about books and historical figures really playing a big role in your thinking. Which historical figures do you look up to the most, and have influenced you the most? And also, if you can share some books as well that have been inspirational for you.
Well, the historical figure who I look up to the most, I suppose, is probably Winston Churchill. I am convinced that Winston Churchill saved Western civilization with his tenacity, with his vocabulary, his ability to speak and to understand people, to manipulate situations. I mean, I think he was brilliant. And I mean, obviously there's so many though, Caleb. I mean, you have to admire, you can't be an American without admiring George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Well, I won't.
I mean, with Winston, when I just think about if he can make decisions while being bombed, right. I could figure out a way to close this deal.
Sure. No, that's absolutely right. During the toughest period for the company. I mean, the early period was very tough, but we kind of expected it, and then, there were only 20 of us, and everybody knew they were signing up for a risk. The period of the Great Recession, 2018, we had a couple of thousand employees. We were a bigger company, and I have to say, I forgot how to sleep during that period. Rick and I used to trade texts at 3:00 in the morning. But I had two books by my bed. I had the Bible, and I had a collection of Winston Churchill's speeches to Parliament. And you're right. If it's a really helpful mental construct to think, if they could do that, I can do whatever it is you're, thinking of, whether it's the job I had in Vietnam initially, or, if I could do that, I can do anything. If I could get us through that period, if we could make it through that period, we could do anything. So, yeah.
And one of the things that I really appreciated about the book is the breakdown of building a life first and foremost.
Sure.
I would love to hear behind the process of selecting that as the first thing that you wanted to share with the readers. And I'll have a follow-up question after that, and then business after.
Okay. One of the things I say in the beginning of this book is that these reflections, these statements of how people should behave were things I aspired to, and I did not pretend for a moment that I had succeeded. And I think that knowledge sort of helped guide us in answering your question. I never knew the meaning of work-life balance. I never even heard of the concept. I defined myself, to my shame. I defined myself by what I was doing for a living. I always prided myself on my family. I always prided myself on my kids. But I was not a guy who went home at 4:30 in the afternoon to coach my kids. I got to, some of the games, more than some fathers, but not as many as I've gotten to my grandchildren's games. And so this was maybe a genuflection to the fact that I should have been more focused on work-life balance. Maybe part of the explanation for why I'm so devoted to my wife. She stuck with me. She supported me. She was an inspiration. So anyhow, so that's, it's the best answer I can give you.
Yeah. And then throughout the book, for future readers, you include your poems that you've written throughout your life.
Right.
I would love to hear what was one of the first poems that are in the book that you've written, and which one's one of your favorites, if you recall, from those that you included in the book as well.
Well, I guess one of my favorites is the one about the bluefish recipe, because where it ends by talking about eating the bluefish with my daughter is such a sort of surprise ending that it makes it fun. One of the first ones I wrote was the one about being out fishing by myself in the Atlantic, and the awesomeness of that experience of just being out there all by myself with whales surrounding me.
Yeah.
I never thought, despite my being an English major, I never thought of myself as a poet. I didn't think of this stuff as as poetry. I wrote it almost always. I wrote this stuff when I was feeling awestruck, whether it was at the birth of a child, the beauty of what I was seeing, the uniqueness of the experience.
Mhm.
And when we were putting the book together, the woman who edited it, who was great, said, "Well, now I want to see your poetry." I said, "What poet?"
Who told you?
No,
Not letting you into my closet.
nobody had ever seen that. I'd never even told anybody about it. I certainly never showed it to anybody. I finally figured out what she was talking about. So I brought it in, and in some respects, I think, I probably reread this a few times too, Caleb. I think some of it is some of the best stuff in the book.
Mm.
It's not that it would get me a good grade in a poetry course, but there's one of the early ones. It was read. I was up at an event up at Hobart and William Smith, where we've provided some support to a program up there for first generation college students, and the professor at the end of the year there was a gathering of these kids, and they were getting their diplomas, and the professor got up and started reading this poem. And I thought it was really familiar. But it ended up, she started talking about, there was a line that says, "I feel like a Cracker Jack in a box ready to go pop." That was a line from one of the very earliest poems I wrote when Barbara and I were first married. I had my new career, and I just couldn't wait for all the good things I had the opportunity to accomplish.
Right.
Great feeling.
So in the section Building a Life, you broke it into dignity and integrity, passion, everyday life, love, family and friends, spirituality, and a virtuous life. And just to touch on just a couple from each of those subsections. So in dignity and integrity, one of the things that you talked about was about self-image being the key to success. Where did you derive that principle from? Or if you want to touch on some of the principles as I know.
So, no. I mean, maybe it's my background, in Italian, there is an expression, called bella figura, which literally means pretty figure, good appearance. And you sort of see it in small villages in Italy at about 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the afternoon as people go doing their, or maybe 7 o'clock in the evening after their dinner. They go walking around, town, sort of like we used to do cruising, with our cars. They do walking. And they all look so good. And I think, I find it so disturbing in America, that we've all gotten so casual. And I think this work at home thing has only exacerbated it, where people feel like they can go out of the house wearing sweatpants and, pajamas. You dress for the people you're meeting with. You dress, like the person you would hope to be. If that makes sense.
Very important is
They usually say, I don't like this quote when they say fake it until you make it.
Yeah.
I prefer the act it until you become it. And It sounds like it rhymes with what you're sharing.
It does. And it sounds, whether you're saying it, I'm saying it sounds all terribly superficial, but I don't think it is. I think it's really important. And I agree with you. The fake it till you make it thing is not the right way of describing it. But presumably we all have aspirations, and we should present ourselves in the way we would hope we would be if we fulfilled our aspirations.
In the book, you talk about building a prison cell in concept. And
Right.
the way I look at it is those are the limiting beliefs that one puts on oneself. And the important aspect for people to reach new heights is to shatter that ceiling
Right.
and overcome. For
Right.
someone that is in a tougher situation, for the listeners, if there's a listener out there, what advice would you share with them where they don't have a lot going on for them and, you know, they've lost their confidence? How would you recommend them to reshape their vision of that environment?
That's a really tough question. I'm not a psychologist, or, I'm not trained to be able to really answer the question. What I can say, what I'd rather, if I can reconfigure it, I'd rather say they're not one of us, I think, who has been a child, who hasn't been, who hasn't had our weaknesses pointed out to us, In my case, I used to walk around, people would tell me my nose was too big, I was ugly, I was clumsy. And, any kid who's a little sensitive takes that stuff to heart. And, and bullying can make it far worse, but we all know it happens. I have yet to meet a person who went through his childhood without somebody at some point demeaning him. And I think it's important for all of us to try and understand the universality of that. And to try and understand that to be successful, we have to not ignore it, but use it as motivation to become who we want to be. And that's, again, I'm not a trained psychologist, but I can tell you, when I was a kid, I had an older brother, 10 years older brother, who was a spectacular athlete. He was a great student. He got a full scholarship to go to Trinity College. And he was, honest to God, the apple of my father's eye. And so I lived, and my younger brother lived in the shadow. Even my older sister lived in the shadow of my brother. He truly was, I was clumsier than him. I wasn't as good an athlete as him. I couldn't hit a baseball. My grades were not as good. And that was motivation. It was motivation. It was, I will show them. And, I'm sure if some psychologist will listen to this and say, well, that's not healthy. Healthy or not, it works.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things in your passion aspect of it, on the reflection, there's two that really, really resonate with me. One of them is give them hell always.
Yeah.
And number two is to live in the game and die in it. Would love to hear your thoughts more on those.
Well, I mean, as to the second, I'm 78 years old and I'm still coming into work every day. I spent yesterday in a car driving up and back to suburban Philadelphia, visiting properties. So, I had a phone call with a guy with whom I was trying to make a deal on the way back. So, I think retirement, and this is for Tom Bozzuto. I respect what I do, doesn't apply to everybody else. Okay. But for Tom Bozzuto, retirement is a blue-collar concept. My dad needed to retire. He spent 40 years working in a factory. He spent 20 of those years working from 11 at night until 7 o'clock in the morning. He spent a bunch of those years owning an oil truck, and he'd get up in the morning, and when he got home from work, he'd just get on the truck and go out and deliver oil. he earned a time where he did nothing. I have been spoiled with a career doing stuff I really like. So why I haven't earned the right to retire. Now, I take more time to read than I used to. I take more time to go to grandkids' games. Spend more time with my wife. Spend more time fishing, which I love. But I'm still in the game. That's just, again, I'm not saying everybody needs to do that, or people who don't do it are wrong. I'm just saying that's my poison. I can't remember the first part.
Give them hell.
Oh,
Give 'em hell.
Give them hell
Yeah.
always. Yeah.
Which I think also falls in line with the passion and the value system that you've instilled not only with your company, but I believe also your kids when they were your daughter on horseback. You told her,
Give
give
them
them hell.
Give them hell.
Yeah.
It also ties into what we were just talking about. There's a bit of a show 'em thing. You remember in the book I talk about how it was Harry Truman that they used that phrase with when he was running for president. He was expected to lose. I mean, he was president. He had become president because Roosevelt made him vice president. He was the lesser of many evils. That's why Roosevelt made him vice president. Nobody expected him to be president. He ended up being a fairly controversial president, and the Republicans were convinced that he was going to lose. Everybody was convinced that he was going to lose, including a paper, the Chicago Tribune, that had a headline that the day after the election that said Truman, I guess I can't remember who he was running against, Wallace, I think. Wallace wins, Truman loses. So to give him hell has a touch of not only passion, but showing them. We're going to show them. And I think it works. So
yeah, it works for me.
Yeah, I was going to say another aspect later in the book. I think this is in the business section, talking about some of the best salesmen or negotiators are those that don't lose that confidence along the way.
Yeah.
And I think all that is related to, showing them hell, passion.
Right.
The guy who loses his confidence first is, in games, that's how you win.
Yeah.
I think that was the aspect of it.
Exactly right.
Which is another one under the spirituality and living a virtuous life. So when you buy a dog, let it do its own barking.
Yeah. Well, that has to do about bragging, I mean, I've done more talking about me in this conversation than I like to do because I had spectacular partners. I mean, Rick and John, I want to say we never disagreed. That's probably not true, but we never had a decision where there wasn't consensus made. And, I had great partners, and we would not have survived if Rick hadn't been as good as he was with the numbers and with relationships with lenders. We would never have been as big as we were if John had not been John was a very detail-oriented developer, best developer I've ever seen. He'd work all day and then he'd, change and go run for a couple of, miles and come back, change back into his clothes and go to a public hearing until 1:00 in the morning. And he could convince anybody of anything, because he's just such a good, sincere, honest guy. And Julie Smith, brought a level of wonder. I don't know how to describe it. She brought vision to the management business and really helped us grow it. So, it's all about teamwork.
Teamwork.
One of the parts which go into when you're working at Oxford is they were not able to adapt or be prepared for change.
Right.
How has Bozzuto evolved, and what were the tipping points were leading up to those tipping points you changed preemptively that allowed you guys to prosper and thrive? Because going from, a dozen employees starting out, when you first did the acquisitions, bring people in to 1,000, 2,000 plus, there would have to be some form of evolution, I would imagine.
Sure.
Do you mind touching on that from a business standpoint, from going to, mid-size to a larger company?
No, I don't mind at all. When we when we started the company, our focus was that we were going to build and manage only properties we developed. Having a good management company was important. We decided that. Building our own product was important. We decided that. But it was building our own stuff and managing our own stuff. This was 1988, and it kind of worked until we got to 1992, and the capital markets were like the capital markets are today, and you could not get a dime to do a new project. And we had projects in our pipeline, but we were really struggling to get them done. We were approached by a nonprofit with whom we had a relationship, a volunteer relationship, and who asked us if we would help them build their project for them. It took some effort on the head of our construction group at the time's part, and Rick and John's part to convince me that we should do it. But I ultimately agreed, and we built that project. And then the same thing happened in management. Maryland National Bank was still was sort of imploding, and they were dealing with problems. They had problem real estate, but they came to us and said, "We foreclosed on an apartment project near your office. Would you consider managing it for us?" So we got into that business. I mean, so it was sort of like a crab crawling kind of backwards, sideways. But doing that, having that income come in, you sort of said, this isn't such a bad thing. It allows us to keep our people, and give them opportunities, and provides us some income, without us having to take the risk of building projects or developing projects when we
There's nothing to develop.
There's
Right.
nothing to develop. So we said, but I was terrified on the construction side. I was, of the risk. And so we said, we'll do it, but we'll only build for others if they're nonprofits. Because we felt we're dealing with people where there wouldn't be an adversarial relationship. And management was sort of the same thing. I was afraid we were not going to pay attention to the deals we owned. We were going to start paying attention to the third-party deals. But over time, we began to realize that these became a good way to grow the company. Both efforts took off to the point where the construction company has built it probably 2 projects for every one we've developed. And the management company is managing 120,000 units. And, we own, I don't know, 6,000 or 7,000 units.
Right.
So it's, that was an evolutionary change. The other, I'll give you another one. I won't make it so long.
Yeah.
A friend, convinced us he was building condominiums. He was basically building apartments and selling them as condominiums. He said, actually, it was a conversation he and I had, and he said, I don't know why you don't do the same thing. There's plenty of market. Nobody else is doing it. So we tied up a piece of land, but then I was very reluctant to do it. I can remember John, Rick, Bernie, and a development fellow who was working with us at the time named Richard Bowles almost physically threatening me to do it. And we built a project called Silverbrook Farm up in Owings Mills that ended up being a tremendous success.
And that was a condo development?
It was a condo. It was our first condo. And it was great. It was, average price, I think, was $85,000 a unit or something. But most of our customers were young women. It was a terrific formula. And we got an investor. We've always done joint ventures. But on that project, we put up half the equity, and we got a couple of local guys who had some money to put up the other half. When that deal was three-quarter done, one of those fellows said to me, why are you using your money that way? You use your money to go out and find new deals. We'll put up all your equity. And we ended up with a handshake deal with them that they had a first right of refusal on every one of the home building deals we did, condominium deals we did. But they had to put up the money, and if they didn't put up the money, they lost that right. They have to put up the money on every project. So those are just a few examples of where we evolved. You do things. Sometimes they work. Sometimes they don't work.
Yeah.
I give you an example of something we did that we, sort of decided we didn't want to do much more of. When we left Oxford, one of the projects we were building was a nursing home up in Connecticut. And while we hadn't developed it, we sort of could learn enough building it. And what we learned is it was not a business we had any interest in being in. And we made little money, but it was just not what we wanted to do. So, plus there were some other deals that were failures. So anyhow, I mean, you have to be willing to make experiments, take risks, but try not to bet the company on any.
Yeah.
So I know in your book, one thing that I use to this day when I think about anyone who I speak to is in the financial world is divided into two groups, optimists and pessimists.
Right.
Each is right only about half the time.
Right.
Where do you develop that one from? That one right there is one of my favorites. Whenever someone's telling me I'm too optimistic as a person or whatever the case may be, I'm like, well, you're going to be as wrong just as much as me.
Yeah, no, and I'm going to have a lot better time than you.
Exactly. That's why I choose to be an optimist instead.
It's simply an observation based on my reading of how people look at opportunities. There are people who see everything as negative. And I think that's a terrible way to live. I don't think you should be blindly optimistic. But I do think it's a lot healthier to go through life with a glass half full mentality. I think if you do, you bring a kind of joy to what you do that allows you to appreciate things even when they do turn sour.
Right. No, well, thank you for that.
I want to read a quote that you borrowed that says, "Don't think you've hit a triple when you were born on third base."
Right.
One, I think that's a very hard line in terms of, very impactful for those, don't think you discovered sliced bread. Maybe it was the circumstances you were put in.
Right.
And another reflection, leave the earth at least as beautiful as it was the day you were born. And you talk a lot about, impact, giving back. I would love for you to be able to touch on the philanthropic endeavors that you're passionate about, the causes, maybe certain causes that may not get a lot of attention. I would love to give you an opportunity to share all of the ones that you're most passionate about.
Sure. Gosh. I feel like I should write notes. Well, let's break that down. Let's deal with the second part of it, and that's we've given charitably, both at the office and at my family, and we separate it. And the office is mostly focused around housing, community development issues, and the family has primarily been focused on arts and the education, and although I guess we've also contributed pretty significantly to community service support, but you can't do everything, but you need to understand that you have a responsibility to do something. A great line that I heard from the late Senator Paul Sarbanes, and he explained that in Greek, there is a word called idiotos. And idiotos in Greek at the time of Plato and Aristotle was a word that was used to describe the member of the city-state who didn't take an active part in the community, but focused on nothing but his own life. And if you think about that word, idiotos, it is the root of our word, idiot. Mm. And a person who lives his life and shows no concern for the community that he's living in, who shows no concern for his fellow man, is an idiot. Mm. The second part of your question, or the other part of your question was about arrogance, about being born on third base. And this maybe is the optimist of me, but I get so tired of hearing people complain about, I don't have as much money, or I came from a bad neighborhood, or I come from an ethnic group that everybody, looks down on. We're born in America. We could have been born in Zimbabwe. We could have been born in a part of the world where we had 30 cents for our next month to live on. We could have been born in a place where people were bombing us. We're born in America with opportunities that people are dying to be able to share in. And no matter what we do, we have to remember that we were born on third base. I mean, my parents worked in a factory. I had four brothers. Three siblings. There were four of us. I lived in a bunk bed that I shared with my little brother, and my brother there were three of us in a room. There were six of us sharing a bathroom. And woe is me. What crap. Mm. I mean, I had the world's best parents. I had a magical family, a magical childhood. I was teased enough to toughen me, and make me ambitious. And then I had the blessing of a great education at Hobart, and the miracle of a marriage to a woman who more than doubled my abilities, with her love and support. And then partners. I've had the greatest partners any man could have. So who am I to brag? Mm. I mean, I've been as lucky, as blessed as any human being could be.
And I think that hones in on, I have to say, how humble you are as an individual. I know you mentioned this long format interview is something that you're not typically used to the title of the book, Reflections of an Ordinary Man. And I think that speaks volumes to you as an individual. I don't know if you had another question, but I definitely wanted to do the rapid fire questions at the end for the last couple minutes.
Yeah, sure. And it doesn't matter what room that we're in, if the name Bozzuto ever comes up, the one thing that people say is, you have a princely reputation that can only be, garnered from a year of making the right decisions.
Well, thank you very much for that. But you'll notice the first rule in here is about your reputation.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's, you got to work. You got to work to build that and protect it.
Because it can take a day to destroy it.
Yeah.
As Warren Buffett says.
That's the biggest concern about having a big company. I mean, you want to see. Toby too is a bigger man than I am, and very, very few things set him off. But you watch something challenge our reputation, it makes him crazy. And,
rightfully so.
And I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. So some rapid questions you can answer in one words or, very short answers. A little playful one. If you had to choose an animal you relate to most, which one would it be and why?
Oh, God. I guess a bear. Because I love to hug people, and it's sort of, when you think of, not that they do it, but when you think of a bear, it's sort of this envelopment. That's sort of, I guess, when I think of it, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it.
I don't blame you. If you didn't know how old you are, how old would you be?
Essential page. I've got a birthday coming up in a couple of days, so I spend a lot of time thinking about that. The answer is it varies. At the oldest, 50. At the youngest, I was saying to Barbara just the other night that there are times when I feel like I'm 7 or 8 years old. I mean, physically you don't feel that way, but mentally, and the other week when we had that snowstorm, I mean, it's like being a 7-year-old to be able to go out and enjoy the snowstorm. It's great.
You've mentioned your passion for fly fishing and the beauty of the outdoors. What's your favorite, if you don't mind sharing, what's your favorite fishing spot and what makes it special to you?
That's always the hardest question people ask me. It's wherever I'm fishing at the moment. I mean, I would tell you, I guess, I have fished in Chile and Argentina. And I've fished in Chile 4 or 5 times, and I fished at one place where, for whatever reason, I became separated from the guide and my fishing companion. And, being out there, and there are no airplanes flying over, the only ambient sound is the river going by and the birds in the trees, and you feel like you must be the first person on Earth, and you can see the mountains in the background and the fish in the river. It's kind of hard to beat that. It really is kind of hard to beat that.
My last question is, what would you like Tom Bozzuto to be remembered as?
That someone who made life better for others.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, you've made all the difference in my life.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dallas.
Thank you.
Sure.
And thank you for the first episode.